I would say, I think it's something like between 300 and 500 or something like that, but they weren't seconded in the sense that they were almost all men who'd resigned or left the RIC in 1920 or 21. You're talking a tiny number, if any, men who were disbanded from the RIC and went straight into the Civic Guard. So it's a certain type of ex-RIC man who tended to go into the Civic Guard. And I think some of them were resented. There would have been men who would have resented serving under men who'd been in the RIC. Although, as Tom said, their training and their experience was valuable. And the Civic Guard was built on, in terms of training manuals and stuff like that. I heard an account where they were using old RIC batons. They're using old RIC notebooks where they just stuck a new, a label on the front of them. So there is a fair amount of kind of debt, I guess, or the Civic Guard built to some extent on the RIC.
Water cans. Water cannons.
Water cans, yeah, that's it.
Last night.
So,
Mike,
I just wanted to put a question to the group. At some point earlier on today, I think it was said that commemoration tells you more about the time in which you're doing the commemorating than the time that's being commemorated. I'd be just really interested if people agree with that and what this decade tells us about now as against what it tells us about the 1912 to 1923 period. I have a particular reason for asking that because I've become very conscious of the way the Spanish Civil War is looked at in terms of Irish participation in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, all the people who went to the Spanish Civil War went there on principle. Maybe some went for adventure, God bless them. But people on both, from both sides went with, pure intention, we'll say. They wanted to fight for the church or fight for, liberal democracy or whatever it was. But the people on one side now seem to be, we only think of the people on the Frank Ryan end of, and I just feel that says more about now than it does about that time, So anyway, my general question is, does the commemoration that we've had over the last decade tell us anything particular about who we are or what we are as a society today?
I think it's going to be hard for us to judge that right now. It'll be something that they'll look at in 50 years' time, just the same way as when they were the 1966 commemorations. Although women were virtually excluded from that, they wouldn't have thought, as your point, they wouldn't have thought that was unusual. So our liberal changes, all the time. So it's a case of when somebody looks back at this period, will they go, oh, we did include more women. Oh, we did look at the opposite sides and what was going on. I'm not sure if we could judge it for now.
Yeah.
I think it shows that Ireland is very interested in this particular period of history. I don't think there's an equivalent, and there's all sorts of pros and cons with the decades-centenaries in the Irish context and who was remembered and who wasn't. But, I don't think there was an equivalent in even the First World War. A big, I'm not saying they minimise, but I don't think you could compare, 14 to 18 in Britain versus the scale, and particularly the government's involvement and the willingness of the government to delegate a certain amount of it to local authorities, to local groups, to fund that sort of stuff. So I think the fact that there was a decade centenaries in the way that there was says something about how important this period is deemed to be, and the fact that it's probably going to stop dead. Why stop in 23 is the next question. But I think that also shows you that this particular period is seen to be extremely important, and there is a lot of interest in it. Maybe it's only within certain demographics, but again, I'm not sure you get some of the attendances at events that there has been at various points. Depending on the event, I don't know, but I guess that the scale of it maybe says something. Is what I'm trying to say.
Could you give maybe a longer answer to just some of that? Tony and I were involved. We were the council's reps as the coordinators for the past 10 years, and just what we learned, I suppose, if you say what was different about it, whatever. I think the time that we're in, we were much more comfortable with Britain. We weren't looking over our shoulders. Britain had this status as empire and status as kind of the bête noire in a sense. Maybe it's the EU, maybe it's the confidence that we had, maybe it's the fact and the League of Nations, joining the League of Nations sometimes is underestimated. We had taken our place in the nations of the world, and we didn't feel we had to take a shot at Britain. We didn't feel, we were just comfortable in our own skins. I think that's the first thing. That's what tells me about this period. We're at ease with ourselves. I think an important part of the commemoration, it's amazing that there's only one or two issues over the 10 years that we kind of say mightn't have gone so well. That's quite incredible. And we met with Maurice Manning in a symposium like this a few months, 2 months ago. And he thought that the success of the Decade of Centenaries was because it was given to the local authority to coordinate. And I know we have a councillor here today, they have a democratic mandate. We should never forget that, because if you look back on the time, there was no democratic mandate for what was happening with all the different troops, we were a colony, etc. But I think people responded to that. There's also the fact that the more local something was, the bigger the attendance. And we had an event out in Springfield Castle. And there was a reenactment of a march from Broadford, from Athay, from all churches, where people walked for many hours to the castle with a view to collecting arms. Over 1,000 people reenacted that march, and I remember it was crowd control and the aerial shots of that would be worth getting a picture of that. So it was the local. We had a lot of very good commemorations from women's role, and I suppose sometimes we mightn't acknowledge that enough. Sinead McCool had a wonderful exhibition on the women in 1916. She gave wonderful talks in the library. The Limerick Genealogy Service did a family history of the Cllr family and did the whole genealogies. And maybe it's because we tend to remember our last mistake. We don't remember the. And when it went well, we all went home. And good, that was good. So I think that was important. Our local, I have to pay tribute to our councillors. I remember when we sat down at the beginning, we put together a committee of ourselves and the heads of each party. And they said, we're not going to play politics with this. We all had different things. We're going to work together. And throughout the whole thing, there was not one piece of dissent. We would bring our proposals to the Centenary Committee and we would trash them out. The talking was done indoors. We took advice. We gave a little bit of advice we could. And that cannot be overestimated. The contribution of the council over the last 10 years in what could have been contentious issues, but which was handled, etc. Some nice little memories would be, I remember crowd control at Dermot Ferriter's lectures in the City Gallery, having to turn people away, over 200 people seated. The interest was there. The Centenary Gardens that are still used, if you look behind City Hall, whenever when we merged, I remember there was a monument to the Spanish Civil War, but there was none to the Irish Civil War, and we have one there now, and it's used on Remembrance Day, and it's just the flag of Ireland, the flag of Europe. It's just a very nice commemoration, and we did one of those in each of the electoral areas. So I have to say, I think 10 years is a long time commemorating. You're naturally going to get a waning in interest. I can't think of anything that's lasted 10 years. The Limerick hurling team have lasted 4 or 5, 10 years or whatever. So I think it's had a fair good run. But my memory and Tony's memory, we had many late nights, many early mornings, the role that the army played. And again, the army, the democratically elected army for our country, etc. They took part in all the ceremonies with pride, and I must say, I with positivity, is what I think of the last 10 years.
Yeah, certainly I concur with all of that. I think coming along here today, just to look back on the decade of commemoration, 10 years, we had a lot of trepidation, like a lot of people had before they started, and some people were saying it shouldn't be touched, you're better off leave things lie. And, you know, people were anxious and we understood that. The biggest learning I would take out of it is the actual public engagement, and that there was such an appetite there for it, which was very gratifying from our view. And then we were delighted to buy into that, and the community strand was absolutely essential to get it out there, because people felt strongly we were only waiting for an opportunity to show their interest, involvement, memories of, and that's the biggest success of it by far, I think.
We called public meetings. We had one in the city, in Kilmallock, in Newcastle West, where we invited the public in, and our elected members invited the public in to give their ideas what they want, what they would want in the programme. And it was a brave thing to do, what people were saying, but we did it. And I think that was a positivity. And just talk about the historians, I'd just like to thank all the historians, because I suppose you do need, in golfing terms, there's a word called momentum. You need momentum in a programme. It can't sag. And we had momentum, and have kept it for so long. And I know John came out Newcastle West into the city library. Tom contributed and was always there for knowledge. Your good self as well. John O'Donovan had great nights in Cllr. So throughout the county, there was, you know, and I said, a lot of it, because it went so well, it wasn't commented on. It's when you trip over, sometimes that drops.
Yeah.
It's true. You know. So I'd say, having looked at it for 10 years, having looked through all the reports, and to finish up with that final term, you know, the projects that were promised were delivered.
Yeah.
Were delivered, and it's a lot of things are started and never delivered. A lot of things are started and never delivered. So I'd say to everyone, well done. And as I say, naturally there's a bit of a waning now. 10 years is a long time. Yeah. A couple of governments, etc., etc. So thanks for that.
To get back to the RIC, and thank you for your confession about your I was trying while you were speaking to imagine you in uniform. Anyway, I grew up in West Limerick, and my name is Tim, and I was called after my uncle, Captain Tim Madigan.
Yes.
And I listened always about the RIC, and briefly what happened with Captain Tim Madigan, he went to Mungret. He changed totally after he went there, because I think there was a nationalist group there. They had actually volunteers walking up and down Mungret College, and that's where he became a national. Anyway, the man who would have done the census would have been the local RIC knight, who knew him very well indeed. His uncle happened to be the local doctor. Two RIC then came up from Foynes because Tim Madigan had burned down the RIC barracks, so he was a marked man. The two fellows that came up to the doctor, I'd say it was, sorry to take the long story short now, but basically it was only constipation or something. It wasn't terribly important. But the two men came up anyway to the local doctor, and as soon as they did, the man who was working for the doctor to milk the one cow that he had also worked at my uncle's. And a black and tan was in the town. It was Huckabee, a bad article, unfortunately. So Tim Madigan disarmed them, humiliated them, and he said Shannon Golden was the Republic, shoes, boots, socks, cap, all the foreign regalia of the foreign king were publicly burned. They were sent home in their long johns. They were humiliated. But the bottom line anyway was Tim Madigan was a marked man. The military came out and raided after Christmas to get him, but the RIC man came in the back way because he knew how he'd probably make his way, and they shot him dead in front of his mother. I was a pharmacist for 50, 60 years, and when I retired, I did my history as an old age pensioner. But the first thing I did, I went to London to get information in Q. So I met a very nice Scottish man there, and he said, you know, the central role of the RIC was vitally important. Would you like to see all the British maps. And I said, no, I don't want anything to do with maps. Well, he said, you've got to listen to this now. He said, if he said there was an outrage in Ballyhale, the military, the auxiliaries, the RIC, the Black and Tans, nobody had a clue where the hell Ballyhale was, but they had maps.
Okay.
The vital one was the RIC, because they knew the local, they knew the local leaders and the local art. But anyway, the one book that I got out of it all was the D.I. Regan, who was a native of Belfast, and he was a Catholic. And he was stationed, was he the last one in Limerick town?
Yeah,
Yeah.
last one.
And
He went to the North afterwards.
he fought actually in 1916 against the rebellion, because he was a young policeman at that stage, and he was an out-and-out committed loyalist, and eventually he couldn't control the Black and Tan. Would I be right in saying that?
Yeah, he had brother in the Redemptress.
That's right, yeah. And he asked the Redemptress what they thought of him, and they told him in all certain terms. But anyway, Regan retired, and thank goodness we didn't get him as head of the Gardaí.
Yes.
He went to Palestine, and I'm not saying he contributed to the awful disaster that was there, but that was it. But the RIC in my childhood were absolutely hated. I have to say that. So I suppose when you come to something like this, you see the wider picture. Obviously, among them there were decent men, and a lot of them went. What percentage would have gone into the gas? 20%?
Not at all.
Nowhere near.
More like 5%, I'd say.
Oh.
If that.
Oh.
It's 0.5% or something.
Right?
Like that.
And
That's
those,
tiny.
as you rightly pointed out, those were fellas that had resigned beforehand. Of the fellas that were demobilised, I'd say virtually none.
So
It would
a
be
few hundred of
tempted.
them went join the RUC.
Right?
A few hundred of disbanded RIC men joined
Yeah.
the RUC. There was more disbanded RIC men joined the RUC than joined the Civic Guard.
Yes. Now,
Um,
Reagan went to the RIC first, or the RUC first, and what he found was, dare I say it, the green ceiling. He was a Catholic.
they hired a load of Catholics
Yeah.
at the start of the RUC, and then it was supposed to be representing the population, but that didn't last.
They found that they could go so far now from them.
And they weren't wanted in the British police forces. The London Metropolitan Police didn't want men who'd served in Ireland. Even British-born men who were returned back weren't wanted. Because the legacy of the type of policing they'd done in Ireland wasn't deemed. Now, there were pension considerations as well. But the Commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police said, we don't want them, can't take them. So
Well,
that's why some of them went to Palestine, because it was a place.
I'd like to think that one of the solutions in the north of Ireland was getting rid of the RUC, because they were seen as a
But that's
kind of
what they've
military.
done. ISP, was it NI?
PSNI.
PSNI. That's what they've tried to do.
Yeah. Well, I think they've succeeded, haven't they? Largely.
Largely, I would say it's much better than it was. Like in fairness, you see, dare I say it, an RIC man or an ISP coming down here would say, now you may dispute his handling of some things, but the fact that he actually could come down here, it does point up something, that something has changed. That wouldn't have happened 20 or 30 years ago.
You mean Drew Harris?
Yeah.
And they gave us water cans last night as well.
Sorry?
They gave us water cans.
Yeah. For watering the grass, is it?
What have the Romans ever done for us? Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I will change the direction of this conversation. And I will begin by making a reference to Ian McBride, who would be a powerful figure within the historical establishment, who made the point a few years ago in an essay, actually on the IRA, that was about the remarkably unreflective practice of academic history in Ireland. And I think, for me, that was the big reveal of the decade of Centenaries. was the fact that what I felt you saw these narratives that are potentially problematic, most obviously with the empire, which I've already talked about, but you could say it with women too, you could say it with decolonisation, you could say it with issues around race, you could say it, and in a way most obviously over the kind of inevitability of partition, which I just don't believe at all. I mean, this idea that partition was inevitable required very careful curating from about 2019 onwards, and you saw that. And it was one where essentially to have a scholarly persona, in other words, to be given a platform during the period from 2019 to 2022, you had to actually buy into a particular way of seeing that
I would just
period.
like to say, and as someone who works in academic history department, I can't say I've ever experienced anything like that. That would suggest that there was a narrative that I would have had to.
In a way, it's about
it is
about the manufacturing of consent.
And maybe it's about being asked and I wasn't invited if you weren't interviewed to be a certain way, but I can't say I saw much evidence of having to buy into a certain narrative about partition. Now, I think you can argue that the history that came out of all of that, you can perhaps argue that there's
But in a way, it's what's given visibility and what's erased. So if you look, for instance, at a figure like Horace Plunkett, right up until 1920, he is really at the heart of trying to avoid partition. There is a whole element of unionism within Ireland and at a very high level in Britain that is trying to prevent partition from happening. And that is a narrative that you just didn't really see emerge.
So you're saying platform in 1919 you had to...
No, what I'm saying is that was a part of the story that should have been given a level of visibility and it wasn't. And you just question then, well, why isn't that? Why aren't we talking about this? The piece with Ireland Council is the same. Why are we not talking about a large number of people in England who were outraged by the War of Reprisals, who were prepared to turn up to huge meetings night on night from the end of 1920, from October 1920 through to this truce? There were very significant figures involved in Ireland, journalists, Robert Lind, H.W. Nevinson, really, who were part of the liberal media establishment, who were very much part of that. Women, in particular, playing a major part in that. But you just didn't see it as becoming part of the mainstream narrative.
No, I agree with that. I'd just be worried about saying that that's a deliberate sort of top-down policy as well.
Well, it's the consciousness, I'm sorry, within historians. I mean, I've read, there's Boyce's book on, was it Irish, that monograph he published back in the 80s, where he very much looks at in a way, the structuring of support for Ireland in Britain. And that everyone is aware of that narrative. It just didn't come through. And so what I'm saying is that it had actually been filtered out. I think part of I do believe there is an agenda within professional history in Ireland.
Is this the idea that professional historians all get together to
No,
decide?
not at all. It's not. It's just who you let into the room to speak about specific things. And that in a way is about controlling narratives.
Yeah, no,
I guess the narrative is there. The narrative is there in some places. If maybe it has to be sought out. Maybe it hasn't been given by prominence by whoever
But the
makes those
people who
decisions.
have the power to make it
Well,
prominent.
for instance, anything that I've written about Limerick, Angus, I would have made those points about Barringtons and your Limerick Unionists who did not want partition. And when they finally come around to probably see that partition is inevitable, they campaign for, I suppose, they're conscious that they don't want to be isolated themselves, to maintain links with their unionist brethren, in the north as much as possible, and that is definitely there in things I've written. I don't know, Brian, if you've addressed it specifically, but even if you look at something like the forecourts, the local histories of the revolution, what are they called, the Limerick 1912 to 23 and whatever county series, that is in there. It is raised. That point is made. Now, whether it's to the forefront of the mainstream narrative.
In a way, it is. I mean, you mention it, and I'm not denying. I mean, everyone knows perhaps that there are those parts of the narrative. But what I think is there was a very careful curating of what parts of the narrative were. Well, I think it was done through the committee. I think there were. I mean, of course, there were conversations. I mean, I could talk to you about it in terms of casement in some detail and with some level of kind of authority, but I won't.
I wonder, Angus.
But I think you can see it. I mean, I think the way. No, but history has a politics.
It does,
and it's a politics that in the end is about patriotism. And the politics of the decade of commemoration was a narrative that in the end was exclusionary towards a northern input into that revolutionary period. I don't think you saw it. You saw it in terms of the separation of, in a way, a kind of northern commemorative moment and a 26 county commemorative moment. So there was no effort in the south really to move north and to actually embrace some of those figures like Bulmer Hobson, like Francis Joseph Bigger, like Alice Milligan. There were a lot of them were involved. A lot of them were Protestants.
That partitionist mindset is not new though, Angus, is it? And to say that it was there before 2019, it's been there for 100 years probably, and before that maybe in some ways. Various political parties host these type of events occasionally as well. I've been invited to some of them, and I've never actually been invited back by any political party, which I'll take to our credit. But the tone at them is hugely different. So a Sinn Féin event that I attended 12 or 18 months ago, the narrative of this was that partition was the key issue in the treaty debates, for instance. Maybe the more mainstream narrative would be that partition was sidelined and the oath of allegiance was key. So, the politics is key to all of it. So maybe if you look at the makeup of the expert committees, there might be something like that.
But in a way, it's what Tanya was saying also, the fact that there was a recurrence. You began to see the documentaries coming out about the decade of Centenaries, and they were the same voices. It was, and we can't, and it was Damien Ferreter. I mean, I watched, and eventually you just thought, why are just the same old voices being brought out?
Some of that is because people who produce these things know what they're going to get. And you try someone who's never been on television before and they might not be very good at it. Yeah. So with someone like that, you know what you're going to get. And I think part of it is the practicalities as the people who produce these shows would see it.
But then at the same time, if you look at something that was potentially more democratic, like the president's Macknaw.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that again, it was just the same old historians, and they were mainly professors. There were loads of historians who were working outside the establishment or outside the profession. Tom. Why didn't they invite Tom to go and speak there? I mean, he's written a great book on it. Or it didn't matter. There was no variation. It was like only historians have the authority to really dictate how we are to think about this. And we know that history is in a way a structured discipline that is the kind of scholarly persona of an Irish historian who has to in a way configure and kind of fit with how historians look in Ireland.
But my argument is that we jumped outside that lens very well into the community and the public space. I thought we did a great job of moving the conversation away from the academy out to the public, as exemplified here. So like, yes, I do agree that sometimes, but I think that's a comms piece that you're talking about as well. If you have, you know, a television-ready person, and some academics simply don't want to be on camera. I didn't want to be filmed earlier on, you know, so some people do want that arena, and other academics want to keep to the way that they work, which was within the academy. But I do think that we moved well outside of the conversation very successfully.
I mean, I don't feel that I was ever told to conform to a certain, and maybe that's been to my detriment, I don't know without me realising it, but I mean, I write about Southern Loyalists and Unionists and, you know, Southern Irish Loyalist Relief Association.
Yeah, but the fact you gave that paper there without mentioning empire, in a way, was indicative of a kind of structuring of how you look at an event without actually thinking about it in terms of, in a way, the context that really makes it matter.
Yeah, that's a fair point, but that wasn't done as a deliberate, I can't talk about empire. That was a sort of an early first effort to think through some of these things, realising I've got 20 minutes. Like, I completely agree, empire is context. So sometimes you can read in, it's possible to read into the fact that I didn't talk about empire as something that I did deliberately, because I feel that's probably, whereas actually that wasn't the case at all. I was looking at it in a very specific way, given the confines of what I was trying to do, and the fact it's very early in terms of, you know, I've been thinking about this for, you know, a week or two. You know, it's not something I've spent years researching and writing. You know, if I was to publish a piece on it, it might be a very different piece.
But then,
I do like the phrase, you know, never attribute to malice what can be, you know, I'm butchering it, but what can be considered ignorance. You know, so sometimes when we're looking, because I look at all this from a, you know, where were the women point of view, but for most of the time, for like the 1966, when the women were almost wiped out, it wasn't a case of malice of leaving out the women, it was a case of ignorance that the women should be included into it. So it might be the same ideal. It's not a case of malice where the partition was left out. It was a case of ignorance that people didn't include it as much as some might have wanted it.
Or I guess at least what I'm trying to say is that you can maybe overthink the extent to which it's a top-down imposition. I'm not, like, I agree with you in terms of the gaps and I think there's a lot in what you're saying. I'd just be conscious about suggesting that academic historians as a whole feel obliged to conform to a model, because that wouldn't be my experience.
Just on
but again, I think
yeah,
that's
but in
you're
a way,
talking about
it wouldn't be your experience, because in a way you've conformed to that model. I mean, in the sense that you have to go through, you know, becoming an academic is about jumping through hoops. It's about delivering papers. It's about writing monographs. It's about referencing the right people. It's about being seen in the right circles. And in the end, that brokers a particular type of conversation. It is really manufacturing consent. It is the Chomskyan view that, you know, we see within specific limits.
Have you
it's
read
about
everything
optics.
I've written, for example?
What?
Have you read?
Yeah, of course I have.
Everything.
Not everything you've written, no.
So is there an assumption there that I've conformed?
No, but I'm not directing the point.
I'm
of
listening
view,
about
right?
me. I'm saying, of course. Like,
what I'm doing is I'm making a reflective point about the discipline itself. So what I'm saying is that historians took control of the decade of centenaries. I don't think they were particularly reflective of it at the end of it. I think that a specific coterie, if you like, managed to dominate a particular level of the conversation for most of the time. And I think perhaps if there is going to be one real reflective early moment in the last 10 years, it perhaps should come from within the discipline itself. And I mean, I'm not the one, I mean, that sociologist at Queen's University Belfast, whose name
Dominic Bryan.
I mean, Dominic's made
right.
this point. I mean, he has just given out, published several papers talking about why did historians get such a central pole positioning in all of this.
I guess I agree with what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with the explanations fully, but there, yeah.
I think that if you don't mind, I would suggest that it needs to move beyond kind of back and forth.
Fair.
You know what I mean? Just broaden it out.
Back to the women.
More.
Let's bring it back to the women.
Jamie, do you want to
Jamie.
just mention the local, having been involved in all the national meetings for the last 10 years. Don't confuse what we hear in RT as being the whole country. RT, what happened in the 31 local authorities, the range of local interpretations, and approaches
Mhm.
and experiences
Yeah.
was phenomenal. And we heard them firsthand. And as I said, we were up there every quarter. We're also exchanging information with people. And as I said, RT tends to see itself as the centre of the universe, and it's not.
It's
And
not.
As I said, it's not. I said we had one RT person down who happens to have connections with them once, but in the majority of cases we had historians, we had the families. One lovely event we had, which is unique to Limerick, we had the families of the first members of Dooradoyle here, and one of them was actually a son. It was quite interesting.
Oh,
He passed away now. He passed away now. But we gave them centre stage here to talk about what their families' experiences were of the Civil War and the current treaty debates and the whole thing. That was unique to us. And again, it doesn't draw huge attention to it, but it was different. And maybe it's good that we're different. You know the saying, if we all think the same, then none of us are thinking. So I think different views and different interpretations is good as well. I think it's healthy that we all don't agree, because it's always dangerous to agree with everything. But watching what happened in the 31, I had first-hand experience. What happened in the 31, completely different approaches. I mean, Meath, Kerry, completely different take on the world. Donegal, completely Monaghan, Cavan. They're very different stories, unique to their areas. And they said we heard that firsthand, but not through RTE. Like we didn't make it to RTE at all, or whatever. But I think there were 31 local, very local views. And if you ask me what got the biggest attendances, the more local, the bigger the crowd. Come out in Cappamore with different people. The more local, the more granular. That's what people were interested in. Nothing to do with titles or anything else. Local people are interested in local things and they could relate to it and the stories. That's their experience. But I said, lots of different views, and it's good that there's different views.
There's a group going around interviewing. Now, I can't think of the lady's name. It's very, very good. She's going to different areas, getting
Morris
input.
from
Sorry?
Morris O'Keefe, isn't it?
Morris O'Keefe from Kerry, you know.
Yeah.
I think.
Morris O'Keefe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very good. Does it, and she has a very good way of approaching people.
So come back to Mike there.
It's back to you, Mike.
Back to you in the studio, Mike.
I have nothing to add. No, I was just suggesting that
Yeah, that's
just
fine.
brought it out.
Anything else, Mike?
I suppose, yeah, I'm just thinking again about, I suppose, groups that, I mean, actually, maybe this might be an absurd comment now, but the role of how children experienced the revolutionary period. I don't know, has there been much done on that? I mean, I don't know now, so
The RTE figure popularised that approach to
Joe Duffy.
to this study, so
He did actually.
Credit
He did very
there
good
to-
on it.
credit to Joe Duffy.
But I suppose, you know, obviously a great many children were, a lot of them were orphaned, no doubt. A lot of them had, I remember reading biographies of Del Era and different figures from the period that their children were separated for very long periods. I mean, I'm not aware, has there been any studies done on that phenomenon?
Marnie Hay looked at youth movements, you know,
Oh, yeah, that's
studied
right.
youth movements. Sarah Ann Buckley in Galway has looked at, I suppose, the place of children in the social welfare system in Ireland at various times. But it
Including
is,
that period.
yeah.
Cuive Vegas done stuff on the children of the executed leaders of the YC.
Brilliant. I don't mean brilliant like that, I mean it's interesting.
It is brilliant work, yes.
Yeah.
Sounds very interesting.
Sean Gannon is bringing out a new book now on the Protestant experience during that period. That's kind of a different, something we might not focus on before. He's one of our staff, Dr. Sean Gannon, and it's been quoted nationally. It's in the papers, a lot of what's done, so it's due to be launched shortly. And again, it's a different,
Brian was involved in that as
but
well.
it's a different take or a different look.
So Matthew, what's been your experience? I mean, have you been, what have been the high points for you?
I think one of the high points has been mentioned already. I think Sinead McCool's exhibition on the role of women, and it was in connection with the enfranchise the legislation of 1918 that gave the vote to women, and we hosted it in the Isterbrack Hall. I think it was around actually I can remember, I know exactly when it was because it coincided with the local elections of 2019, so it was around May, June 2019, and that was one of the most successful exhibitions. The Limerick Museum's role, and we were just hosting it really, but it was a tremendous event. And we did actually now, I have to say, contribute to it in a modest way. We contributed some artifacts from our own museum collection to it. But I would regard that as one of the high points. I suppose another thing I'd mention would be that, and of course the library service obviously experienced this as well, the impact of COVID. So that, for example, we did an awful lot of online exhibitions to compensate for the fact that we couldn't do live ones. So we've had a lot of exhibitions on aspects of the revolutionary period. I'm just thinking now, we looked, for example, last year, I think it was William O'Neill looked at the role of the various Soviets in Limerick. I know, Sharon, you looked at, you did a number of those online exhibitions, didn't you, Sharon?
Yeah. What they were on right now, I have no idea, because I've done so much stuff.
Well, that's comforting to me now, because I should have a list, but I don't.
Can I just say something about that?
You may.
Because, at the time, doing an exhibition online seemed like a very limited way of doing an exhibition. But they're still there now.
They are. That's right.
You do an exhibition for a couple of weeks, it's gone.
Yeah.
And those are still there now. And we're putting them together because it is a bit disparate where all these projects have landed, in terms of where they are online. So those are being kind of gathered into a single location online, which will be the local studies website. Early next year it will be launched. And there will be a dedicated decade of centenaries. And these exhibitions, we were thinking at the time, it's an awful shame we can't do them in person. They still exist,
they do.
And that's fantastic, And it's a great array. When you see the array of things that have happened over the last few years,
you sent that
those symposia as well, and so forth.
I think the best event I was involved, well, not involved in, attended actually, was that month-long Limerick Soviet event, which was done outside, I think, the auspices of the Decade of Centenaries. And it included Mike Finn's play and all these very good workshops.
That was part of it, Angus. That was certainly part of it.
Oh, was it?
It was,
yeah. I mean, it was really excellent. And I thought what I liked about it was, there was bread baking and printmaking and there were workshops on activism and sort of kind of engaged citizenship.
And that was powerful stuff, Angus, I thought. But some of the historical narratives that were recounted were wildly inaccurate.
That's why you don't get it back,
but I mean, it's in a way what Bulmer Hodgson says at the end of that
that's
thing.
So interesting.
I mean, when Bulmer Hodgson talks about, people just believe in the myth. They're not interested in the history. And at the end of the day, the historians squabble about, what actually happened.
Nobody
really cares.
Well, that's actually very true now. A totally different example is Larry Walsh, who was curating the museum before. He was 77 to 2009. He wrote a paper about 25 years ago in which he proved that Limerick did not have the oldest charter in Ireland and didn't have a mayor before London. And nobody ever read it. Right? To this day, everybody thinks that. And people still ask me about it. And I generally dodge the question to some extent. But I think it does make the point though that it's very difficult for academic research to percolate down into the general population.
But in a way, if you look at the beginning of the 20th century, or the beginning of the revolution, if you date it to founding of the Gaelic League, it is all about a mythologizing of the state and where it's going. And in a way, the kind of English historians who are writing history at that time get in the way of what the nation wants to believe about itself. Right. So in the end, it's inevitable that they're going to not invite you back, I'm afraid. They don't want the facts. We want fake history. We want kind of...
They want to substantiate
We've
the
had
vision.
that circumstance, John, so I don't quite know what that says.
Well, actually, I think it could be fair.
Just
it
on the
could be
highlights,
fair-
Matthew, you mentioned your highlights, you know, and I spoke to
yeah.
a friend of mine about this event recently, and he said that, and this is not to bring it back to the RIC, but he said his highlight of the decade was the RIC controversy, because for him it put the final nail in the coffin of revisionism, to see the reaction of people that people would not accept this, you know, so there are various ways of looking at these things.
I begin to wish I never mentioned my great-grandfather now. I should point out, by the way, he was safely, he was 70 years of age in 1921, so he was long retired. And his brother had died happily for him in
Were they
1879.
potters as well?
What?
Were they potters?
The word.
Proud fish lifters.
Potter's history.
Yeah. He's actually the potted history. You had a point to make, though, Damien, earlier there, I think, hadn't you?
There was one event that happened during the decade of Centenaries, where in 2019 we commemorated the Spanish flu, which had a huge effect. And when we were drawing up the proposal, we said, who would be interested in a strange virus that would travel from Europe? And how would that get anyone's attention? So we did it online, and a couple of weeks later we were all closed down. It's amazing how history repeats itself. Yeah. So Sean Gannon did a really good, and it's online. Sean Gannon did a really good exhibition, and the numbers that died, it's phenomenal.
1,000
Yeah.
How many?
Out of 1,000.
Oh, yeah.
1,000. So it had a bigger impact nearly in terms of loss of life. And
Especially
people
over
actually went to
1980.
work in the morning and dropped dead.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it was younger people.
And young people just literally left the house in the morning and
Yeah.
so we were saying, this won't grab attention, there'll be no interest in it. Who's interested in the virus? And a couple of weeks later, it's the bestseller. People are interested. People were looking at it then.
Yeah.
So you never quite know what will be
That's
a
exactly
hit.
it.
So the positive history is what we're looking at now, right?
Yeah.
So everything
That's
the
right.
channel of development is good.
1980.
That's a good one, actually. History.
Yeah, it is actually.
You know, actually, just another thing that I think, Tom, Toomey, you contributed a lot to this, and I think you touched on it as well, though, the history of sport, which obviously has become it's a big growth area now. And strangely enough now, though I've never kicked a ball in anger in my life, but I find it very interesting myself from a social history perspective. But I know you've done a lot, Tom, on the history of sport, haven't you, in Limerick in the
I did an
revolutionary
article.
period?
You see, there was a group, an organisation called NAGAC, you know, the National Association Against Athletics Clubs, and it was only in a couple of counties. It was a breakaway from the GA, and Limerick won 2 All-Irelands under them, right? 1916 and 1917. And then in 1918, they won us under the GA. So, like, the thing is all over the place. 2 of the clubs that were involved in the breakaway, Croom and Fedmore, no, they put the kernel to the breakaway. They contested the 1919 GA county final. So this, you know, okay, as I said, it was all over the place. But typical Limerick, breakaway. No.
Do you count those All-Irelands?
Sorry?
Do you count
They
those
all count,
All-Irelands?
right? They all count.
They count the 1918 one, they don't count the other 2.
Do you count them?
Right?
You count them all?
When it suits me.
You wrote about the old GA as well, did you, during
I wrote a history of the GAA in UL and the colleges that preceded UL.
Yeah.
So Toomey College, for instance, which was fascinating because it was the first PE college, we call it, in the country at the time. It must have been a very exciting place to study or to teach. And they had a team that won an All-Ireland Club football championship in 1978. And Brian Mullins, who was a student there, told a story that the only time he was, and Brian Mullins was a physically domineering presence on a sports field, and would have been known as a very
rough,
strong, robust player.
That's great.
And he said the only time they ever felt any hint of fear on a football pitch was going to play in the Limerick County Championship, because the students were seen as aliens, you're not welcome and you've no place here. Colleges shouldn't play against clubs.
Gandhi, Rasky.
And Say again, Tom?
Galbally or Askew.
Well, that's more recent again, like, so there's a long history of that, but it was interesting to kind of, like, these kind of avant-garde students out in Thomond weren't very welcome around Limerick, on football pitches anyway.
No.
I think that's a feature, I know it's a feature of history in general, that in recent decades that areas like sport or like, I know fashion history is something that interests me now because of our Limerick Lace, but I mean they were not proper history until 30 or 40 years. Proper history is about kings and emperors and wars and revolutions.
And men.
And men. So things like, well, yeah, but even sport didn't, even when it was dominated by men, it still was, and I suppose popular culture, all these areas that are now considered legitimate, like Owen Devereux now, for example. I know he's a sociologist, but a lot of the areas that he would have explored in recent decades would just not have been considered. And I mean, I think that did find its way into the decade of Centenaries as well, didn't it? Like, I believe it or not, I do remember 1966. I was only 8. But I do remember it was all very. I remember there was this lovely television series called Insurrection, and it was very, very well done. But it was all very serious, and it was all men, of course. But there was no question of any frivolities about outside of politics and about military history. So, I think from that perspective, at least, if from no other perspective, the decade of Centenaries was much more inclusive than previous commemorations.
Yeah, even the idea of shared history was, wasn't something that would have been entertained.
Correct.
At an earlier time, or the idea of parity, of esteem, or anything else of that nature. But again, it reflects the politics of the day and society of the day and all the rest of it, rather than reflecting the 1920s.
And that's exactly the first question. One of the first questions about how we're going to be reflected on now in 100 years' time. How are we going to look at what we had done and read our books and go.
As long as we're still getting the royalties, Sharon. Fine.
The whole tradition of bands in Limerick, tradition of the strength of rugby in Limerick, that comes from that whole period. That it has marked us as that's a little bit different. It's unusual to find a rugby enclave. And the marching bands that come from America every year to play in Limerick, the tradition of the bands that play around the city, and they've recently published a book on the...
It's on sale in the library, by the way, or the museum.
So that's a unique character, that's a unique thing to Limerick.
It might be worth mentioning as well that up to 1916, certainly that rugby players were much more likely to be found in the ranks of the volunteers than GAA men. Started to change after that. After 1918, maybe with the GAA, had been very kind of careful about its position.
And was that a class division or what?
That's it. There was, within Limerick again, it's more complicated in that around 1917 there was a split in the city IRA, and there's an element of class to that certainly as well.
Yes, definitely.
Working class in Dublin, because in Dublin City, working class people played soccer.
That's right.
They didn't play rugby, and GAA took a long time to really dig into Dublin City. So I think Dublin class is part of it anyway. Someone like Oscar Traynor would have always said you can play soccer, and rejected that notion. Todd Andrews, they rejected the idea that you had to play Gaelic games to be a good Republican or whatever, But certainly soccer was the working class game.
That feeds into what Damien's after saying now. Rugby only became a working class game in Limerick among Irish cities and towns. I mean, obviously it became a working class game in places like Wales and so on, South Africa, whatever.
Even to call it a working class game in Limerick is a bit of a simplification, isn't it? It wasn't just a working class game.
Well, that's
a working class element alongside the other.
But then, of course, there was stratification amongst the rugby players in Limerick, wasn't there?
Among the clubs, like you might say that was a working class club.
Correct.
That was
so it's
Owen and Boas got up there.
Yeah.
The cookies in Shannon were down there.
Yeah.
We'll leave the cookies out of this now.
Right? I'm a thirsty nerve.
There's a brilliant piece of local journalism from the Connacht Tribune, actually, just to go away from them for a minute, about St. Jarlath's College in Toomey and the CBS in Toomey, and they met in a big colleges or schools football match or fight. as it was called, and the headline was "The Day the Anoraks Beat the Raincoats."
Brilliant.
So the CBS had beaten Jarlath's. And this local journalist commented on the crowd and the social profile of the supporters of the crowd and whatever.
Yeah.
And it was a great success because it managed to obviously annoy everybody in the town of Tune on both sides of the Anorak raincoat.
You saw the same thing in Ennis CBS planners back in the day, and in Kilkenny CBS and Peels back in the day.
Yeah.
It's funny now, that actually brings up something now that wasn't, not that I'm aware, it was highlighted in the decade nationally, was, I suppose maybe it's old fashioned now to talk about class. You know, I know the whole with the death of communism and all that, but there wasn't a whole lot of analysis of how class conflict played into the decade of Centenaries. Now, I'm ready to be standing corrected, but I don't think it really did. I suppose the labour movement to some extent.
I think people like Porrick Yates started to write about class in a way that maybe hadn't been done a whole lot before. Gavin Foster, in fairness. But it might be, it's one of those areas that is undercooked probably still,
Yeah.
in fairness.
Yeah, I wondered as we look forward to 50 years' time, that was a question that I kind of considered, because we are joking about, men and women, but have we looked at, intersectionality, and is that what has to happen, as we approach these conversations? And a second thing that occurred to me, because I won't forget this now, because I'm thinking about everything y'all said, I'm learning loads, is that maybe a way that we can continue to keep the spirit of these conversations alive is by attaching them to things like sports or like, fashion or like, those kinds of histories. So maybe we can weave it into, no pun intended, but weave it into other areas and other conferences where we invite everybody to say whatever they want to say to each of those maybe that's a way that we can continue to keep it alive by not necessarily making it about the thing, but by weaving it through.
Yeah.
But I think that is an important point.
It is.
To think why. I mean, again, the Limerick Soviet was a classic moment because, History Ireland, which tries kind of almost, endlessly to mark events as they happened, especially in that centenary.
Yeah.
And there was no mention of the Limerick Soviet at the time.
Right.
Eventually, I think they did do something later on. But I remember being conscious of that. And I wondered if that was, in a way, a reluctance really to confront issues around class.
The Soviet is brilliant though, because there's so many contradictory dynamics there.
Yeah, I know.
There's the class, right? There's the Catholicism.
I'm sorry.
And no particular interest group now is happy, I think, to acknowledge all of them. If you are a radical left-winger now, you might not want to say, well, all these guys said their prayers at 6 o'clock every night. Or if you are from another perspective, you might not want to say it was communist, it was a communist influence. So.
Is this Soviet regarded as a significant event beyond its importance in Limerick?
It's not even regarded in Limerick, Mike, is it really?
No.
Beyond,
Well, I know one thing that, from a national perspective, we get letters from the An Post asking us to suggest something that might be worth commemorating in a stamp. And in 2017 and 2018, I wrote on both occasions in reply to this letter saying that the Limerick Soviet, and they came back with some nonsense that it wasn't worthy of, it wasn't of national importance or something like that, And then I tried to write back then, but I think, had you to respond to some bloody website or something like that, so I just couldn't be bothered. But the point is that was an example of, and then they seem to be focusing on just silly things then. I mean, I think they bring out a stamp to commemorate that Castro's mother was there was some Irish connection to
yes.
Was there some nonsense of that nature, wasn't there?
Well, look, all history is important.
There's an element that you can't commemorate.
Yeah, well that's true.
There were a lot of Soviet South County.
But the Limerick Soviet clearly wasn't as sexy as Castro's Irish connection.
Having said
There were a
that,
lot
I
more
do know
Soviet
that
South County than there were.
Cllr actually included as part of their programme.
Which the Limerick
Cllr, Yeah.
The Limerick Soul?
Really?
Which had no relevance whatsoever,
Oh my
that I
God.
could say. And yet it made it out of Limerick and I saw
That's
advertised
amazing.
lectures and talks in
Yeah.
Kildare. on the
We
Limerick Soul.
can't
So-
commemorate everything, and that's
That's
what
true.
you're
Yeah.
talking about forgetting.
Yeah.
That's
There
right.
always has to be things that aren't going to be commemorated.
Sure.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think if you expect commemoration to meet your own preferences, you're going to be disappointed
That's very
at some point.
Yeah, but in that, but if you take that point further, was there in the end a kind of trajectory in terms of what was being remembered and what was being forgotten, especially in that earlier
I think
period,
it probably was.
that,
yeah.
that built up to that moment of the inevitability of partition?
I think quite possibly, but I just wonder about why that was the case, and is it the case
Because that was what they were fearful of, was the kind of, you know, that people in 2020, as you said in your own paper, you know, that everyone said after 1960, you know, everyone patted themselves on their back and said, you know, we did great work. And yet then I remember hearing a guy, actually someone from the Irish Army, talking in the cathedral about that. And after an event in 2016 and saying, you know, well, the easy part is now over. We've got the hard years to look forward to, you know, meaning the War of Independence and the Civil War.
Good point.
And, you know, and I just wonder if there was a kind of level of structuring. And I mean, you know, you're going to say there was a committee set up to decide, in a way, what got commemorated
To
and how it
advise is
got
what they would say,
commemorated.
but
Hmm?
they would say their job is to advise rather than decide, but yes.
Yeah, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, I agree, but at the same time, there were pressures. I mean, I remember someone from the Taoiseach's office in about 2012. I got a call from him. I have his name written somewhere. Bring me out and asking me out for lunch, and he took me out to lunch in a Chinese restaurant in Dublin. And all he wanted to do was essentially get my view on commemoration and what I thought of it, and you know, and my case. And he was kind of, it's fine. I was happy to talk, but I never. And then he went into that department that was set up for the commemoration as part of the of culture. But he'd come from the Taoiseach's office, and I never heard another thing from him. But I mean, there was definitely a gathering of information in advance, and I don't know when those papers will come out, but it will be interesting one day to actually follow the logic of, you know, the discussion between the Department of the Taoiseach, between culture and heritage, between local authorities. I mean, I went to that thing in the library right at the beginning. Do you remember that?
That was pre-2016, was it?
Yeah, this
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
I think it was, yeah.
Yeah.
Were you at that?
I wasn't yet.
Yeah, I remember you gave the
remember
main
you, yeah.
gave the main thing, talk that night.
Yes. But I mean, you're correct in saying that there were, you know, set things to commemorate, given equally on a night like that was open to the audience to suggest perhaps more local things of relevance that wouldn't have been mentioned. And that's where it took legs, we found, on the night of these. And just like we're talking about the Limerick Soviet, that certainly wasn't on the recommended list. Yet it was highly
But that emerged,
relevant, and when that came, people ran with it and bought into it, yeah. And I suppose, you know, can you ever be that prescriptive? You say everything on this list should be included, or should you ever be able to ask? So it was a general type of guideline I would have interpreted it to be, and after that, you added to it and you listened and you might have and what you could in your own individual area. So you had that two-stranded approach to it.
I don't think politicians always have great, no, I don't want to generalise, but if you look at the Taoiseach's office, how historically literate is the Taoiseach's office? So how much of what they're doing is...
Yeah, but then Morris Manning and...
on assumptions, you know, but from the there's an interplay between Morris Manning and the Taoiseach's office, and who's going to override who, and I don't know, I think you're right to say...
And that
looking at those maps
between
would be
Manning
interesting.
and Martin Manser is an interesting
Yes,
one.
yeah.
And that would be interesting to eventually figure out what...
But I just wonder if some of it, rather than being sort of kind of deliberate top-down, a deliberate effort to set a certain agenda, some of it is to do with kind of a lack of historical literacy, or are there people making assumptions about what history people want to hear? What are the kind of things that are going to draw a crowd? What are the kind of stories that we want people to hear, as opposed to saying, here's this narrative that we have to pursue?
No,
I'm not saying that's not there, but I'm just
But
wondering.
it's about political literacy as well, like, isn't it?
Yeah.
We'll just say partition, I don't know if we would all kind of generally agree on this, or to some extent at least, the partition was glossed over
Yeah.
more so than the realities, the nasty realities, the brutish realities of the Civil War were addressed fairly full on, because
That's right.
perhaps, I don't know, off the top of my head, because we've kind of we accept that, but partition is a live issue in a way that anti-treaty versus pro-treaty is not a live issue. I don't know, is that the reality of it? Like?
Yeah. Matt?
I think at this stage, I think we might bring the proceedings to a conclusion.
Well, we have